Welcome to the darkest corners of the Bermuda Triangle. Tonight, 3 terrifying stories await: the Vanishing Cruise, the Submerged Colony, and the Pilot's Haunting. Like and subscribe if you dare. Now, let's begin. The Elysium, a towering luxury cruise ship, glided smoothly over the calm Atlantic waters under a crimson sunset. It was the maiden voyage, a 7-day journey through the tropics, with its final destination being Miami. Over 2,000 passengers, dressed in glittering evening attire, filled the decks, sipping champagne and laughing as music and revelry echoed into the endless horizon. Among them was Claire, a young journalist assigned to cover the ship's debut. Though skeptical of its grandeur, she couldn't help but be charmed by the polished teak decks, crystal chandeliers, and smiling staff. Everything on the Elysium seemed perfect, too perfect. As the night deepened, Claire took to the top deck for some fresh air. The sea stretched in all directions, dark and infinite, the stars above like cold, indifferent eyes. It was there she first noticed something odd. Despite the clear skies, the horizon ahead seemed cloaked in a thick, swirling fog. "Must be a passing cloud," she muttered, shaking off the unease. Back inside, the air grew heavy with the excitement of a masquerade ball. Masks hid the identities of dancers, their laughter strangely hollow as the grand clock struck midnight. Just as Claire raised her camera to capture the scene, the ship jolted violently, throwing passengers off balance. The music screeched to a stop, and an eerie silence fell over the ballroom. "What was that?" someone whispered nervously. Before anyone could respond, the lights flickered and dimmed, replaced by the soft glow of emergency lights. From somewhere deep below, deck came the groan of metal bending under pressure. A crackling voice from the intercom cut through the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We've encountered an unexpected anomaly." But Claire wasn't calm. Her journalist instincts kicked in, and she rushed toward the bridge for answers. Yet, as she pushed through the panicked crowd, she realized something chilling. More than a few passengers who had been dancing moments ago were missing. The fog outside thickened, enveloping the ship in a ghostly shroud. The Elysium felt like it was being swallowed whole. Then, the first scream rang out from below deck. Claire froze as the scream echoed through the dimly lit corridors, slicing through the tense air like a blade. She turned toward the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. It had come from the lower levels. The once lively cruise now seemed like a lifeless labyrinth, its opulent halls casting eerie shadows in the flickering emergency lights. Pushing aside her fear, she descended the spiral staircase to the lower deck. The hum of the engines had ceased entirely, replaced by a chilling silence punctuated only by her footsteps and the occasional creak of the ship. The doors to the cargo hold were slightly ajar, and a faint, otherworldly glow seeped through the crack. Taking a deep breath, Claire stepped inside. Rows of neatly stacked luggage lined the walls, but something was terribly wrong. The temperature dropped sharply, and her breath came out in visible puffs. In the center of the room lay a shattered glass case. Its contents, a strange triangular artifact, were scattered across the floor. A dark mist seemed to emanate from the fragments, pulsing faintly with an unnatural rhythm. "What the hell is this?" she whispered, reaching for her camera. Before she could snap a photo, a low growl rumbled from the shadows. Claire whipped around, her flashlight catching glimpses of something. No, someone, lurking in the corner. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. A figure stepped into the dim light, a man in a torn steward's uniform. His eyes were wide with terror, his lips muttering incoherent words. "They're taking them," he stammered, his gaze darting toward the artifact. "It's too late. The ship. It's a beacon now." "What do you mean? Who's taking them?" Claire demanded, but the man's body convulsed violently. He collapsed, his flesh dissolving into the same dark mist that surrounded the artifact. Claire stumbled back in horror as the mist swirled upward, forming tendrils that seemed to reach toward her. Suddenly, a deafening horn blasted through the ship, followed by an unnatural wailing sound that reverberated through the walls. Claire fled the cargo hold, her mind racing with questions. As she reached the main staircase, she stopped cold. The ballroom, once filled with panicked passengers, was now completely empty. Masks and shoes lay scattered across the floor, but there was no sign of the people who had been wearing them. A chilling thought gripped her. The ship wasn't just drifting through the fog, it was being claimed by it. Then, from somewhere above, the intercom crackled to life again, the captain's voice distorted and unrecognizable. "Welcome to the other side." Claire's blood ran cold as the captain's distorted words echoed through the empty halls. Every instinct screamed at her to abandon ship, but the lifeboats were useless in the thick, impenetrable fog. Gritting her teeth, she climbed toward the bridge, determined to find answers, or at least someone still in control. Each step felt heavier than the last, the oppressive silence pressing down on her like a physical weight. When she reached the bridge, the door was locked tight. "Captain, is anyone in there?" she shouted, pounding on the metal. No response. She glanced at the security keypad beside the door, its screen flickering faintly. It required a code. She cursed under her breath and turned to leave when a faint scratching noise stopped her. It was coming from the other side of the door. She pressed her ear against the cold metal, holding her breath. The sound grew louder, more frantic, as if someone, or something, was clawing to get out. Suddenly, the keypad lit up and began cycling through random numbers on its own. With a final beep, the lock disengaged and the door creaked open. Claire hesitated, her flashlight trembling in her hand before stepping inside. The bridge was in shambles. Broken glass littered the floor, and the ship's controls sparked intermittently. The room smelled of burned circuits and salt water, but the strangest thing was the absence of the crew. Not a single soul remained, only their uniforms, lying on the floor in neatly folded piles. She approached the captain's chair, her breath catching as she noticed something carved into its leather surface. "Turn back." "What is happening here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The radar screen suddenly came to life, emitting a high-pitched whine. Claire flinched, watching as a single bright dot blinked in the center of the screen. Slowly, more dots appeared around it, forming a perfect triangle. The radio beside the radar crackled, and a deep, guttural voice emerged. "You were never meant to leave." Before she could react, the windows of the bridge fogged over, and ghostly handprints began appearing on the glass, each one larger than the last. Claire stumbled back as the handprints started to press inward, the glass groaning under the pressure. Then, with a deafening shatter, the windows exploded inward, and a freezing wind howled through the bridge, carrying with it faint, anguished whispers. Claire shielded her face, her heart racing. But when the wind died down, the whispers remained. One voice rose above the others, clear and unmistakable. "Join us." Suddenly, the ship lurched violently to the side, throwing Claire to the floor. The radar screen flickered once before, cutting out entirely, leaving her in complete darkness. Claire groaned as she pushed herself off the cold, shattered floor of the bridge. The ship groaned with her, its structure straining as though being dragged by an unseen force. The darkness pressed in, suffocating and alive, but Claire's flashlight flickered back to life, its narrow beam cutting through the void. She had to get out of the bridge. Her instincts screamed danger, but as she turned toward the door, she froze. They were standing there. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, but no. The outlines of figures filled the doorway, their shapes barely discernible in the faint light. They stood motionless, their heads tilted unnaturally, like marionettes awaiting orders. Who are you?" Claire stammered, her voice barely audible. The figures didn't move, but their presence was suffocating. Slowly, one of them raised an arm and pointed toward the shattered windows. Claire turned to see the endless ocean, now eerily calm, glowing faintly under the unnatural fog. Suddenly, the room felt smaller, colder, as though the ship itself was sinking into the abyss. The whispers from before grew louder, surrounding her. "Leave," the voices murmured in unison, their tone both a warning and a plea. Claire didn't need to be told twice. She bolted from the bridge, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls as the ship groaned again, tilting sharply to one side. She clutched the railing for balance, her mind racing. Where were the other passengers? Had they truly vanished? She found herself on the promenade deck, but something was wrong. The fog outside the windows was thicker now, pressing against the glass like a living thing. Shapes moved within it, shadowy, indistinct, but undeniably there. Claire's eyes widened as she realized the shapes were the passengers. She recognized their clothes, their faces. They stood motionless in the fog, staring up at her with hollow eyes. "No," Claire whispered, backing away from the glass. "This isn't real." But it was real. The fog began to seep through the cracks of the windows, curling toward her like skeletal fingers. Claire turned to run, but stopped short as she saw a reflection in the glass. Behind her, on the deck, stood the same shadowy figures from the bridge. One of them moved closer, and for the first time, Claire saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. Where its features should have been, there was only a void, a swirling emptiness that seemed to pull her in. A cold hand gripped her shoulder, and the voice whispered directly into her ear, "There's no escape." The lights flickered, and then, darkness. Claire's scream was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. She stumbled blindly down the corridor, her flashlight flickering with a weak, erratic pulse. Behind her, the hollow footsteps of the faceless figures echoed, growing louder with each passing second. She clutched the railing as the ship swayed violently again, the eerie silence of the ocean outside amplifying the sound of her own panicked breathing. She needed to find help, find someone, anyone who could explain this nightmare. Turning a corner, she saw a faint golden glow emanating from a door at the far end of the hallway. The letters on the plaque read, "Observation Room." Without hesitation, she pushed the door open and slipped inside, locking it behind her. The room was unsettlingly pristine, its large windows offering a full view of the endless, fog-drenched sea. The source of the glow was a vintage lantern placed in the center of a polished table. Surrounding it were several photographs, yellowed with age. Claire's hands trembled as she picked one up. It showed the Elysium, but something was wrong. Its name was scrawled in an older, unfamiliar font, and the people in the photo wore clothes from a different era. She flipped it over, her heart skipping a beat at the handwritten note. "Lost to the Mist, 1912. Beware the fog. It remembers." Her gaze darted to the other photos. They depicted different ships, all of which had disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle over the last century. The final photo made her stomach drop. It was a picture of the ballroom from earlier that night, filled with the same passengers she had seen. But their faces were blurred, smudged into grotesque shadows. A cold chill swept through the room, and the lantern flickered. "Claire!" The whisper came from nowhere, and everywhere at once. She spun around, her flashlight shaking, but the room was empty. Then, her eyes caught something horrifying. Her reflection in the window was not her own. The figure staring back at her had sunken eyes, pale, lifeless skin, and a twisted, haunting grin. "No, no, no, no!" Claire backed away, but the reflection stepped forward, pressing its hand against the glass. The surface rippled like water, and cracks began to spiderweb outward, distorting the image. Before Claire could react, the glass shattered inward, and she was sucked into the freezing mist outside. She clawed desperately at the air, but her body felt weightless, as though she were falling through an endless void. Then, just as suddenly, she hit solid ground. Gasping for air, she found herself back on the ship, but something was different. The corridors were darker, twisted, and the air was thick with a metallic tang. And then she heard it, the sound of distant, mournful singing. It was coming from deep within the ship, drawing her forward against her will. Each step she took echoed louder than the last, and with every echo came a whisper, one word repeating over and over, "Home." Claire's legs felt like lead as she followed the haunting melody deeper into the bowels of the ship. The walls around her seemed to pulse, their surfaces warped as though the ship itself was alive. The air grew colder with each step, and the whispers in the shadows grew louder, forming a chilling symphony that merged with the distant song. The corridor ended at a rusted iron door, its surface covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. Claire hesitated, her breath hitching as the song on the other side grew louder, clearer. It wasn't just a melody, it was a chorus of voices, harmonizing in an eerie, sorrowful lament. She pushed the door open with trembling hands, and the sight that greeted her was beyond comprehension. The room was vast and circular, its ceiling disappearing into a swirling vortex of mist. In the center stood a massive, jagged crystal, glowing with an unnatural light. Around it, dozens of shadowy figures knelt, their heads bowed in unison, their voices rising and falling in a hypnotic chant. Claire's heart raced as she realized these figures were the missing passengers. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, their bodies swaying rhythmically as if controlled by unseen strings. Join us." The voices seemed to call directly to her, pulling her forward. Her feet moved involuntarily as she approached the crystal. As she drew closer, she noticed something horrifying. Inside the crystal, faint images of people were trapped, their faces frozen in silent screams. One of the shadowy figures slowly lifted its head, and Claire gasped. It was the man she had seen earlier in the cargo hold, the one who had dissolved into mist. His lips moved, but his voice didn't match his body. "You can't stop it," he said, his tone hollow and distant. "The Elysium sails between worlds now. You're part of the offering." "Offering? What offering?" Claire demanded, her voice shaking. Before he could answer, the crystal pulsed violently, and a deafening roar filled the room. The shadowy figures all turned their heads toward Claire in perfect synchronization, their lifeless eyes fixed on her. The vortex above the crystal began to churn faster, and a dark figure started to emerge from its depths. Its form was massive, shifting like smoke, with glowing red eyes that pierced the darkness. "You have brought me the final piece," the figure boomed, its voice echoing like thunder. Claire stumbled back as tendrils of dark mist snaked toward her, wrapping around her wrists and ankles. She struggled, but the mist was too strong, dragging her closer to the crystal. The chanting grew louder, drowning out her screams. "Let me go," she cried, but the mist tightened its grip, lifting her off the ground. The dark figure loomed closer, its eyes locking onto hers. "You belong to the Triangle now," it said, its voice filled with ancient malice. The room began to collapse, the walls crumbling into the swirling void. Claire's vision blurred as the crystal's light consumed everything around her. And then, darkness. Claire awoke to the sound of waves lapping against metal, her head pounding as if caught in the grip of a terrible dream. But as her vision cleared, the cold truth hit her like a tidal wave. She was still on the Elysium. The grand corridors were gone, replaced by rusted walls dripping with seawater. The once pristine carpet squelched under her feet as she staggered to her knees, gasping for air. The ship groaned like a dying beast, its structure warped and barely holding together. The only light came from the distant glow of the crystal, faint now, but still pulsing like a dying heartbeat. "You can't run," a voice whispered from the shadows, and Claire turned to see the man from before, his hollow eyes fixed on her. His body flickered like static, half real, half illusion. "Why me?" she demanded, her voice hoarse. "What does it want?" "The Triangle doesn't take it random," he replied, his tone mournful. "It feeds on those who seek answers, who push too far. You stepped aboard with questions. Now you'll never leave." "No," Claire muttered, shaking her head. "There has to be a way out." The man's face twisted in pain. "There's only one escape, but it comes at a cost." Before Claire could ask what he meant, the ship lurched violently, throwing her against the wall. The sound of twisting metal filled the air as the fog outside thickened, pressing against the windows like a living thing. The dark figure she had seen before reappeared, its massive form filling the corridor. "You cannot defy me," it boomed. "Your soul is bound to this vessel." Claire's breath caught as the mist began to envelop her, pulling her back toward the crystal. But this time, she fought harder. She grabbed a shard of broken metal from the ground and slashed at the tendrils of mist. "Let me go!" she screamed, driving the shard into the glowing core of the crystal. The room exploded in a blinding light, and the ship's structure began to unravel. The shadowy figures let out agonized wails as the vortex above consumed them, their forms dissolving into nothingness. Claire felt herself falling, her body weightless as the ship disintegrated around her. The last thing she saw was the dark figure, its red eyes narrowing in fury before vanishing into the void. Then, silence. She awoke on the deck of a fishing boat, her clothes soaked and her hands trembling. The crew gathered around her, their faces a mix of relief and confusion. "You're lucky we found you," one of them said. "What were you doing out there, all alone?" Claire opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She turned her gaze to the horizon, where the Bermuda Triangle lay shrouded in fog. The Elysium was gone, but its shadow lingered, and in her mind, the whispers continued. "You'll come back. They always do." The Nautilus II, a state-of-the-art research submarine, descended into the dark depths of the Bermuda Triangle, its exterior lights carving through the pitch-black waters. Aboard the vessel were Dr. Elena Vargas, a marine archaeologist driven by her obsession with uncovering lost civilizations, and her small crew of 3, Jack, the experienced pilot, Sam, the nervous engineer, and Mira, a fearless diver. Their mission was to investigate strange sonar signals detected on the ocean floor, signals that suggested the existence of a massive, unexplored structure. "This could be the find of the century," Elena said, her voice filled with a mix of excitement and unease. She stared at the monitors as the sonar displayed a massive silhouette, faint but unmistakably geometric. A submerged city, maybe even older than Atlantis? Jack gripped the controls tightly. "We're nearing the signal source. Depth, 9,000 meters. Visibility is..." He paused, frowning at the screens. "Wait, what's that?" On the sonar, strange flickers appeared around the outline of the structure, moving erratically. It almost looked like a swarm of... something. "Could be fish," Mira suggested, but her voice wavered. "No way," Sam muttered, adjusting the controls. "Fish don't behave like that at these depths." The submarine's lights illuminated a vast alien landscape, towering spires of stone, arches carved with intricate symbols, and a sprawling city that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. The architecture was otherworldly, shimmering with an eerie bioluminescence that pulsed like a heartbeat. "Welcome to the colony," Elena whispered, awestruck. Jack maneuvered the sub closer to one of the larger spires, its surface engraved with swirling ancient patterns. Suddenly, the exterior lights flickered and the submarine shook violently. "What the hell was that?" Jack shouted, gripping the controls as alarms blared. "Something's interfering with our systems," Sam yelled, frantically typing on the console. The lights stabilized just as Mira gasped, pointing out the window. "Look!" Outside, in the city's shadowy depths, dozens of glowing eyes stared back at them. "Those aren't fish," Elena said, her voice trembling. Before anyone could react, the submarine lurched forward, dragged by an unseen force deeper into the heart of the city. The comms crackled, and a chilling guttural voice filled the cabin. "You should not have come." The Nautilus, too, groaned under the pressure as it was dragged further into the submerged city. The glowing eyes outside moved in unison, their eerie light casting shifting shadows across the cabin walls. "Reverse thrusters!" Elena shouted, her voice breaking with panic. "I'm trying!" Jack yelled, his hands gripping the controls. But the sub wouldn't budge. It was as if the city itself was pulling them in. "Something's locking onto us," Sam said, sweat dripping down his face as he frantically scanned the systems. "It's like a magnetic field, but stronger." "It's calling us," she whispered, almost in a trance. "What?" Mira snapped, grabbing her arm. "What are you talking about?" Before Elena could respond, the submarine suddenly halted, as if released from the invisible grip. They floated in eerie silence, just meters away from the dome. Its surface shimmered like liquid metal, and faint whispers seemed to emanate from within. Jack exhaled in relief, but kept his hands on the controls. "Whatever that was, we're not sticking around to find out." "No!" Elena said, her voice sharp. "We've come too far. We need to explore this." Mira frowned. "Explore? Did you hear that voice? Something doesn't want us here." Ignoring her, Elena gestured to the dive suits. "Mira, prep for an external inspection. I want to see that dome up close." "You're insane," Sam muttered, but Mira reluctantly obeyed. Minutes later, she stood at the airlock, her suit's headlamp casting a faint glow in the murky water. "Stay close to the tether," Jack said over the comms. "We're not losing you out there." Mira stepped into the abyss, her movements slow and deliberate. The dome loomed before her, its surface pulsating like a heartbeat. As she reached out to touch it, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. "Elena, there's something inside," Mira said, her voice shaky. The moment her gloved hand made contact, the dome lit up with a blinding light, and Mira let out a blood-curdling scream. "Mira!" Jack yelled, but the tether snapped, and she was pulled into the dome's shimmering surface, vanishing in an instant. The whispers ceased, replaced by a chilling silence. Then, the voice from before returned, echoing through the cabin. "One by one, they will join us." "Mira!" Elena screamed, slamming her fists against the glass. But the water outside was still, the faint glow of the dome pulsating like a cold, mechanical heartbeat. "She's gone." Jack muttered, his face pale. She just vanished. No, Elena said, her voice firm despite her trembling hands. We're getting her back. How? Sam snapped, his voice laced with fear. Did you see what happened? That thing swallowed her. The submarine's interior lights flickered again, and the whispers returned, faint but insistent. They seemed to echo from within the very walls of the Nautilus too. We're not alone down here, Jack said, gripping the controls tightly. We need to leave, now. But as he attempted to steer the sub away, the dome's glow intensified, and the submarine's systems shut down completely. The cabin plunged into darkness, save for the faint, ominous light emanating from the dome. Power's dead, Sam said, his voice barely above a whisper. We're sitting ducks. Elena, what do we do? Jack asked, desperation creeping into his tone. Elena didn't respond. Her gaze was locked on the dome, her mind racing. The runes on its surface began to shift, rearranging themselves into patterns she almost recognized. It's a message, she murmured, more to herself than the others. A warning, or an invitation. The whispers grew louder, forming fragmented words. Help us. Trapped. Release. Suddenly, the dome emitted another burst of light, and the monitors flickered back to life. The screens displayed strange images, glimpses of a thriving city, its inhabitants moving gracefully through air and water. But the images quickly shifted, showing chaos, towers collapsing, waters rushing in, and the once beautiful city being consumed by darkness. Then came Mira's face, her expression frozen in terror. She appeared to be screaming, but no sound came through. She's alive, Elena said, her eyes wide. She's inside the colony. Before anyone could respond, the submarine's controls lit up on their own. The sub began moving, descending deeper into the city, as if guided by an unseen hand. Who's controlling this? Jack shouted, trying in vain to regain control. The whispers converged into a single voice, cold and resonant. The door must be opened. The sacrifice must be made. The Nautilus II came to a sudden halt before an enormous gate, its surface etched with the same glowing runes as the dome. Whatever's in there, we're not opening it, Sam said, backing away from the console. But the gate began to open on its own, revealing a dark chasm beyond. From its depths came a low, rumbling sound, a sound that felt like the growl of a slumbering leviathan. The voice returned, louder this time. Welcome to the colony. Your fate is sealed. The gate yawned open, revealing a cavernous void. The faint glow from the runes barely penetrated the oppressive darkness, which seemed alive, shifting like liquid shadows. Jack's hands shook as he gripped the controls. I'm telling you, we turn back now. We can't, Elena said firmly, her eyes locked on the chasm. Mira's in there. This colony holds secrets, answers to what happened to all the others who disappeared here. We can't leave without her, or without knowing the truth. Forget the truth, Sam snapped. We won't make it out alive. The submarine system sparked, and suddenly the Nautilus II began moving forward again, as though drawn by an invisible force. Elena, we're being pulled in, Jack yelled, slamming the controls. I can't stop it. The whispers intensified, swirling around them like a malevolent wind. As the sub crossed the threshold of the gate, the lights flickered wildly, and the monitors displayed distorted images, faces of people long dead, their expressions frozen in agony. Elena's breath caught as a single, haunting figure appeared on the screen. Mira, her eyes wide and glassy, her lips forming silent words. She's calling for us, Elena said, her voice barely audible. The sub came to a sudden halt inside the chasm, its lights revealing an enormous cathedral-like chamber. Massive pillars stretched into the darkness above, their surfaces carved with alien symbols that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. In the center of the room stood a towering obelisk, its surface pulsating with a sickly green light. What is that? Jack whispered, his voice trembling. Elena's eyes widened. The heart of the colony, she said. It's alive. As if in response, the obelisk emitted a deep, resonant hum, and the walls of the chamber began to shift. From the shadows emerged figures, humanoid but grotesquely deformed, their skin glistening like wet stone, their eyes empty voids. They were the colonists, Elena realized, her voice hollow. The city's collapse. It changed them. The figures moved with a slow, deliberate grace, forming a circle around the sub. One of them stepped forward, raising a withered hand. Its voice rasped like sandpaper on stone. The door was opened, and we were forsaken. You will take our place. Suddenly, the obelisk's light flared, and a deafening roar shook the chamber. From the depths of the chasm, something enormous stirred, its movement sending tremors through the ground. Jack shouted over the chaos, "What the hell is that?" Before anyone could answer, a monstrous shape began to rise, a colossal serpentine creature, its scaled body coiling around the obelisk. Its eyes glowed with ancient fury as it fixed its gaze on the sub. The whispers merged into a single, piercing command. "Kneel before the Leviathan." The creature loomed above them, its vast body coiling and twisting around the obelisk, each movement sending ripples through the water. Its eyes burned like twin suns, their light searing into the submarine's cabin. Jack's hands trembled as he fought the controls. "We're trapped," he muttered. "We're sitting ducks." "Elena, what do we do?" Sam asked, his voice cracking. Elena's eyes remained fixed on the Leviathan. Its sheer size and presence were overwhelming, yet she couldn't tear her gaze away. The runes on the obelisk flared brighter, casting a sickly green glow over the entire chamber. "It's not just a creature," she whispered. "It's a guardian, maybe even a god. The colony didn't fall by accident. It was punished." The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if urging them to act. "Sacrifice," they hissed. "Balance must be restored." The Leviathan reared its massive head, its maw opening to reveal rows of jagged teeth. A deep guttural sound reverberated through the chamber, shaking the submarine violently. Cracks spiderwebbed across the glass of the viewing window. "Elena, we need to get out of here," Jack yelled. "We can't just run," Elena snapped, her voice cutting through the chaos. "It wants something from us, something we have to give, or none of us will survive." Suddenly, the monitors flickered again, showing Mira's face. Her expression was calm, almost serene, as she mouthed a single word: "Release." Elena's heart sank. "She's telling us to release the obelisk," she said. "That's insane," Sam shouted. "We don't even know what it'll do." "We don't have a choice," Elena said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "Whatever's trapped here, it won't stop until it's free." Jack cursed under his breath but nodded. "Fine. How do we do it?" Elena scanned the controls, her fingers flying over the console. The obelisk pulsed in response, its light growing blindingly bright. The Leviathan let out another earth-shattering roar, its coils tightening around the structure. As Elena activated the release sequence, a deep rumble echoed through the chamber. The ground beneath the obelisk began to crack, and torrents of bubbles rushed upward as ancient machinery groaned to life. The figures surrounding the sub began to convulse, their bodies disintegrating into streams of black mist that swirled around the obelisk. The whispers turned to screams, filling the cabin with an unbearable cacophony. Then the Leviathan's massive head snapped toward the submarine, its glowing eyes locking onto Elena. "You have awakened the doom," the voice boomed, shaking her to her core. "The balance must be paid, in blood." Before anyone could react, a tendril of water shot through the fractured window, wrapping around Sam's neck. His scream was cut short as he was yanked from the sub and pulled toward the obelisk. "Sam!" Jack shouted, but it was too late. Elena watched in horror as Sam's body was consumed by the light, his form dissolving into the obelisk. The Leviathan roared triumphantly as the chamber began to quake violently. The city was waking up. The Nautilus, too, shuddered as the ancient city came alive, its structures groaning like the bones of a long-dead giant. The obelisk pulsed wildly, its light now reaching every corner of the vast chamber, illuminating more twisted figures rising from the shadows. "Sam?" Jack whispered, his face pale, his voice filled with disbelief. "He's gone." "We're next if we don't move," Elena snapped, her hands trembling as she tried to regain control of the submarine. But the controls were dead, the vessel locked in place by the Leviathan's overwhelming presence. Outside, the glowing runes on the city's spires began to shift and multiply, spreading like veins across the ancient stone. The whispers returned, louder and more frenzied, their words blending into an incomprehensible chant. Elena turned to Jack. "There has to be another way. The obelisk is the key, but the Leviathan won't let us near it again." Before Jack could respond, Mira's face appeared once more on the monitors. This time, her expression was twisted with urgency. Her lips formed a single phrase, repeated over and over, "The source. Destroy the source." Elena's breath caught. The obelisk isn't just a beacon, it's a prison. Whatever power holds this city is tied to it. If we destroy it, we might take the whole city down, Jack finished, glancing nervously at the Leviathan, whose coils were tightening around the structure as if sensing their plan. The submarine rocked violently as another tremor ripped through the chamber. From the depths of the chasm, more monstrous shapes emerged, slithering, shadowy beings that defied explanation. "We don't have much time," Elena said, grabbing a manual override lever. "Jack, prepare the emergency explosives. If we can get close enough to the obelisk, we might be able to blow it apart." "Are you serious?" Jack shouted. "That thing will rip us apart before we even get near it." "Do you have a better idea?" Elena shot back. Jack hesitated but eventually nodded, his jaw clenched. He quickly activated the sub's emergency explosives, their blinking red lights filling the cabin. The Leviathan's roar echoed through the chamber as it lunged toward the submarine, its massive jaws snapping inches from the hull. "Brace yourselves!" Elena yelled as she thrust the lever forward, sending the sub hurtling toward the obelisk. The vessel's lights flickered as the energy emanating from the structure grew more intense, threatening to tear them apart. Just as they reached the base of the obelisk, a tendril of water lashed out, slamming into the sub and throwing them off course. The hull groaned under the impact, cracks spiderwebbing across the viewing window. "Now, Jack!" Elena screamed. Jack hit the detonator, and the explosives launched from the sub, embedding themselves in the obelisk's surface. The Leviathan let out a deafening roar, its body writhing in fury. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a blinding flash, the obelisk erupted in a massive explosion, sending shockwaves through the entire city. The force of the blast sent the Nautilus spiraling out of control, its systems sparking and failing. As the light from the explosion faded, the Leviathan's massive form began to dissolve, its anguished roar echoing into silence. The city's structures started to collapse, the spires crumbling and sinking into the abyss. "Elena, we're sinking!" Jack yelled, fighting to stabilize the sub. But before they could react, the floor of the chamber split open, revealing an even deeper, darker void, and the submarine was falling straight into it. The Nautilus, too, plummeted into the chasm, the remains of the ancient city collapsing around it. Debris rained down, narrowly missing the submarine as it spiraled deeper into the darkness. The screams of the dying colony echoed like a funeral dirge, the whispers replaced by a deafening silence. "Jack, stabilize us!" Elena shouted, gripping the edge of the console as the submarine spun uncontrollably. "I'm trying!" Jack yelled back, sweat pouring down his face as he fought the failing controls. Sparks flew from the panels, and the emergency lights flickered erratically. The chasm seemed endless, a black void swallowing them whole. Just as Elena thought they would fall forever, the submarine crashed onto a rocky ledge with a bone-jarring thud. The lights dimmed, and for a moment, everything was still. "Is everyone alive?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack groaned, clutching his side. "I think so. But this thing won't hold together much longer." Elena's gaze shifted to the viewport. Beyond the cracked glass, a faint glow emanated from deeper within the chasm, a strange, pulsating light that seemed to beckon them. "We're not done yet," Elena said, her voice resolute. "You can't be serious?" Jack muttered. "This sub is falling apart, and you want to go toward that?" "It's the source," Elena said, pointing to the light. "Whatever's keeping this place alive, it's down there. If we don't stop it, everything that happened here will happen again, and we won't be the last victims." Jack hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. "Fine, but if this goes south, I'm blaming you." The two of them donned their dive suits, knowing the submarine wouldn't survive another journey. They exited the sub and swam cautiously toward the light, their headlamps cutting through the murky water. As they approached, the glow intensified, revealing a massive heart-like structure embedded in the rock. Its surface pulsed rhythmically, veins of bioluminescent energy coursing through it. Surrounding the heart were the shadowy remnants of the colony's inhabitants, their forms frozen in twisted agony. Elena felt a crushing weight on her chest as the whispers returned, faint but distinct. One must remain. One must pay the price. Jack shook his head violently. Number? No way. We destroy it and get out. Both of us. But Elena knew better. The obelisk had been a lock, and the Leviathan, a guardian. Destroying the heart required something more, someone to take its place. Jack, listen to me, she said, her voice calm despite the terror gripping her. One of us has to stay. That's the only way this ends. Like hell I'm leaving you here, Jack snapped, his voice cracking with emotion. I came here to uncover the truth, Elena said softly. This is my responsibility. Before Jack could protest, Elena swam toward the heart, placing her hands on its pulsating surface. The whispers grew deafening, and a searing pain shot through her body as the energy of the heart began to consume her. Elena, no! Jack screamed, but it was too late. The heart's glow intensified, enveloping her in blinding light. The cavern shook violently as the ancient energy began to dissipate. Jack was thrown back by the force of the explosion, tumbling into the current that carried him upward, away from the collapsing chasm. The last thing he saw before the light faded was Elena's silhouette, standing motionless before the heart, her form slowly becoming one with the colony. Jack awoke hours later aboard a rescue vessel, his body battered but alive. The chasm and the colony were gone, swallowed by the ocean. But in the quiet of the night, as he stared out at the endless sea, he swore he could still hear the whispers. And deep below, in the darkness of the abyss, a new guardian stood watch. Captain Eric Grayson had flown hundreds of missions in his 20-year career as a pilot, but this flight, a small charter plane carrying only 5 passengers, was supposed to be routine. The weather was clear, the sky stretched endlessly above the Atlantic, and the hum of the engine was steady. Yet, as they entered the infamous Bermuda Triangle, unease crept over him like a shadow. The radio crackled. Eric frowned and adjusted the frequency. Miami Control, this is Flight 217. Come in, static answered him, followed by a faint, garbled voice. 217, Mayday, coordinates. Eric's heart skipped. The voice wasn't coming from the control tower. It was another pilot, but distorted, as if from a distant time. This is Flight 217, he said cautiously. Who's transmitting? Over. The static surged, and then a chilling reply cut through. This is Flight 19. Lost. Help us. Eric's hands froze on the controls. Flight 19 was a legendary mystery, a squadron of Navy bombers that vanished in the Bermuda Triangle in 1945, never to be seen again. This has to be a joke, he muttered, but the voice continued, more urgent now. Follow. The light. Don't leave us here. Suddenly, a brilliant pulsating light appeared on the horizon, far too bright for any natural phenomenon. It flickered like a beacon, luring him toward it. The passengers stirred uneasily. What's going on, Captain? A woman asked nervously. Eric ignored her, his focus locked on the light. This is Flight 217. I've received a distress call. I'm altering course to investigate. The plane veered toward the beacon, and as it drew closer, the light grew blinding, consuming the horizon. Eric shielded his eyes, heart pounding. Then, without warning, the light vanished. The instruments went haywire, the compass spinning wildly. The plane trembled as if caught in a violent storm, though the sky outside was eerily calm. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, the turbulence stopped. Eric looked around in confusion. The world outside was unrecognizable. The ocean below shimmered with an unnatural silver hue, and the air felt thick, oppressive. A new voice crackled over the radio, deep and distorted. You've crossed the threshold, Captain. There's no turning back. Eric's blood ran cold as the ominous voice faded into static. He scanned the alien landscape below, endless waters that seemed to ripple with shadows just beneath the surface. Captain, what's happening? The woman's voice trembled. The other passengers clung to their seats, their faces pale. We're off course, Eric muttered, fighting to keep his voice steady. But I'll get us back. Stay calm. The altimeter and compass continued to spin uselessly, the needles twitching as though guided by unseen hands. Eric switched to manual controls, but the plane responded sluggishly, as if resisting his commands. "Look!" a passenger shouted, pointing out the window. Eric followed their gaze and felt a chill grip his spine. Out of the mist, 5 shadowy planes emerged, flying in perfect formation. Their silhouettes were unmistakable, Grumman TBM Avengers, the very aircraft flown by Flight 19. "That's impossible," Eric whispered. The planes moved with eerie precision, their propellers spinning soundlessly. As they drew closer, he could see the pilots, faces obscured by helmets, their visors reflecting nothing but darkness. One of the planes peeled off and flew directly alongside Eric's, so close he could almost reach out and touch it. Its pilot turned to face him, and Eric's breath caught. Behind the visor was no human face, only a hollow void, black and endless. "Captain, get us out of here!" someone screamed. Eric snapped back to reality and yanked the controls, but the ghostly planes followed, their formation tightening like a noose. The radio crackled to life again, the deep voice returning. "Do you understand now, Captain? This is where all lost things come. Follow, and you'll see." Suddenly, the lead ghost plane dove sharply, its nose pointing toward the shimmering sea below. The others followed suit, disappearing one by one into the water as though it were a portal. The beacon flared again, illuminating the spot where the planes had vanished. Eric hesitated, his instincts screaming to turn back, but the radio blared with the desperate cries of a pilot. "Don't leave us! We're trapped! Captain, we have to do something!" the woman pleaded, her eyes wide with terror. Taking a shaky breath, Eric tightened his grip on the controls. "Hold on," he said, his voice grim. "We're going in." He aimed the nose of the plane at the glowing water and plunged toward it. The moment they breached the surface, everything went dark. The cabin lights flickered violently as the plane plunged through the shimmering surface. For a moment, Eric felt weightless, suspended in a cold, suffocating void. Then, with a jarring shudder, the plane stabilized. The eerie silence was broken by gasps and muffled cries from the passengers. Outside, the once familiar sky was gone, replaced by an oppressive darkness lit only by faint, greenish glows that pulsed like veins in the water. "Where are we?" one of the passengers whimpered, her voice barely audible over the droning hum that now filled the cabin. Eric struggled to steady his breathing as he peered out the cockpit window. Below them stretched a vast underwater city, its massive towers and bridges encrusted with barnacles and draped in ghostly seaweed. Pale, flickering lights glimmered from within the structures, casting long, unnatural shadows that danced across the ruins. "It's a graveyard," Eric murmured. Suddenly, the plane jolted as if struck by something. Alarms blared, and the controls seized up in Eric's hands. "We're losing altitude!" Jack, one of the passengers, shouted. Eric fought against the controls, but the plane continued its descent, drawn toward a massive spire at the center of the city. The beacon's light emanated from its peak, pulsing rhythmically, like a heartbeat calling them closer. The radio crackled again, the deep, resonant voice returning. "You have entered the threshold. You must witness." As the plane descended, Eric caught glimpses of strange humanoid figures moving through the city streets. Their bodies were warped and elongated, their hollow eyes glowing faintly as they turned their faces upward, tracking the plane's descent. "What are those?" Jack whispered, his face pressed against the window. "They're watching us," Eric said, his voice low. The plane shuddered violently as it came to a rough landing on a massive platform near the spire. Sparks flew as the wheels scraped against the slick, coral-encrusted surface, and the engine sputtered to a halt. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the faint, echoing hum that seemed to come from the spire itself. "We're not alone here," Eric muttered, unbuckling his harness. He turned to the passengers. "Stay in the plane. I'm going to check it out." "You can't be serious," the woman cried. "We need to stay together." But Eric was already stepping toward the hatch, his mind drawn inexplicably toward the pulsing beacon. The moment he opened the door, icy water rushed in, soaking his boots. He climbed out onto the platform, the air thick and heavy, as though the ocean itself were pressing down on him. The spire loomed ahead, its surface covered in strange, glowing runes that pulsed in time with the beacon's light. As Eric approached, he heard faint whispers, voices overlapping in an incomprehensible chorus. Then, from the shadows, one of the humanoid figures emerged, its movements unnervingly fluid. It raised a spindly arm and pointed toward the spire's entrance, its hollow eyes locked on Eric. Behind him, the plane's radio hissed to life, the distorted voice speaking once more. "Step inside, Captain. It's time to remember." Eric hesitated, his breath misting in the damp, otherworldly air. The humanoid figure stood motionless, its hollow eyes unblinking as it gestured toward the spire. Behind him, the passengers watched from the plane, their faces pale with fear. "Don't go in there!" the woman shouted, her voice muffled by the heavy atmosphere. But the whispers in Eric's mind grew louder, compelling him forward. He stepped toward the spire's entrance, a jagged archway carved with glowing runes that pulsed in rhythm with his racing heartbeat. As he crossed the threshold, the air grew colder, and the whispers transformed into distinct voices, fragmented and overlapping. Lost, trapped, remember? Inside, the spire opened into a cavernous hall, its walls lined with what appeared to be glass panels. Each one displayed a moving scene, flickering like old film reels. Eric approached the nearest panel, his pulse quickening as he realized what he was seeing. It was a plane, its passengers frozen in mid-scream as the cabin filled with water. The next panel showed a different aircraft, its crew desperately trying to send a distress signal as their instruments failed. The images grew more horrifying with each step, a grim archive of every plane and ship that had vanished within the triangle. This is where they ended up," Eric whispered, his voice trembling. He stopped before a panel that sent a chill down his spine. It showed an older model aircraft, its markings unmistakable, Flight 19. The pilots' faces were obscured, but their terror was palpable as they flew deeper into the stormy sky. Suddenly, the image flickered, and Eric's own face appeared on the panel, his eyes wide with fear as he gripped the controls of his plane. The whispers surged, louder and more insistent. "You are part of the chain. It's time to see." A cold wind swept through the hall, and the walls began to shift, the panels rearranging themselves to form a path leading deeper into the spire. At the end of the path stood a large circular door, its surface engraved with intricate glowing symbols. The radio on Eric's belt crackled, and the distorted voice returned. "Beyond this door lies the truth, but truth demands a price." Eric clenched his fists, fear warring with a grim determination. He had come too far to turn back now. Ignoring the growing dread in his chest, he pressed his hand against the door. The runes flared, and the door groaned as it slowly swung open. A blinding light poured out, and Eric shielded his eyes as the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. Then, the light dimmed, revealing a massive chamber within. In its center stood an ancient monolithic structure, its surface covered in the same glowing runes. Around it floated spectral forms, pilots, sailors, passengers, all trapped in an endless loop of their final moments. Eric staggered forward, his heart pounding as he realized one of the ghostly figures looked exactly like him. Before he could react, the monolith's glow intensified, and the voices converged into a single, chilling command. "Remember who you are, Captain. Remember what you've done." The chamber pulsed with an unnatural light, its glow casting jagged shadows across the ancient walls. Eric stood frozen as the spectral figure bearing his likeness floated closer, its eyes dark and hollow. The whispers had become a relentless chant, echoing through his mind. "Remember, remember." "What is this?" Eric demanded, his voice shaking. "Why am I seeing myself?" The ghostly doppelganger raised its translucent hand, and suddenly Eric's mind was flooded with memories. Memories that didn't belong to him, or so he thought. He was no longer in the chamber, but sitting in the cockpit of an older plane. His hands gripped the controls, sweat dripping from his brow as storm clouds closed in around him. The instruments flickered wildly, and the radio blared with frantic voices. "Captain Grayson, we're off course!" a co-pilot shouted. Eric's heart raced as he realized he was seeing the final moments of Flight 19. He turned his head and caught his reflection in the cockpit glass. It wasn't his younger self. It was him, as he was now. "No, this can't be," Eric whispered, but the memory continued, unstoppable. "Stick to the formation!" He heard himself bark over the comms, his voice commanding but tinged with desperation. "We'll break through the storm." The storm intensified, and the light from the beacon appeared in the distance. The crew hesitated, but Eric made the fateful decision to follow it. The light swallowed them whole, and the next thing he saw was the underwater city, just as it was now. But it didn't stop there. In flashes of horrific clarity, Eric saw the truth. He had been the one to lead Flight 19 into the triangle, drawn by the same mysterious signal. He had led them all to their doom. "No!" Eric shouted, clutching his head as the visions receded, leaving him gasping for air in the glowing chamber. The spectral figure spoke, its voice a haunting echo of his own. "You are not the first, and you won't be the last. The triangle calls, and the cycle repeats." Eric stumbled back, his mind reeling. "Why show me this? I couldn't have been there. I wasn't even born then." The deep voice from the radio returned, rumbling like thunder. "Time is meaningless here, Captain. You are bound to the triangle, as you always have been. Your fate was sealed the moment you answered the call." The monolith's glow intensified, and Eric felt a force pulling him closer. The ghostly forms of Flight 19 and countless others circled the monolith, their faces twisted in eternal torment. "Let me go!" Eric shouted, fighting against the pull. But the voice only laughed, its tone cold and final. "There is no escape. You are the key to keeping the balance, and the balance must be maintained." The floor beneath him began to crack, and a black void opened, tendrils of shadow reaching out to claim him. Eric's screams echoed through the chamber as the whispers grew louder, merging into a single, inescapable truth. You were always destined to return. Eric's body was dragged toward the monolith, his boots scraping against the slick stone floor. The spectral figures surrounding it began to chant, their voices hollow and mechanical. "The keeper must rise. The balance must endure." "No!" Eric roared, clawing at the ground, but the shadows wrapped tightly around him, pulling him upright before the glowing monolith. His reflection in its polished surface was warped, his face gaunt, his eyes sunken, as if the triangle had already claimed him. The deep, resonant voice filled the chamber once more. "You led them here, Captain. Each decision, each action brought the triangle closer to claiming its next sacrifice. Now you must complete the cycle." "I didn't know," Eric gasped, his mind racing through fragmented memories. He saw the faces of the passengers, the terror in their eyes as the light swallowed them. He saw himself again, younger, standing beside the same monolith as it pulsed with energy. The whispers in his mind grew deafening, filling the gaps in his fractured past. He had been here before, in some impossible, endless loop. Each time he had served the same purpose, to guide the triangle's victims to their fate. "Why me?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. "Why do I have to do this?" The monolith flared, and the shadows surged forward, forming the outline of a towering, otherworldly figure. Its eyes were empty voids, and its form shimmered like heat waves over black water. "You are the bridge," it intoned. "The triangle exists to hold what should not escape. Its power must be fed, its cycle unbroken." The figure gestured toward the spectral forms of Flight 19, frozen in their final moments of panic. Each soul sustains the balance, but the keeper must bear the burden of guiding the lost. Eric felt the weight of the truth pressing down on him like the ocean itself. He wasn't just another victim of the triangle, he was its servant, cursed to carry out its dark will for eternity. "Let them go!" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Let the passengers go, and I'll stay." The towering figure regarded him silently for a moment, then spoke with a finality that sent a chill through Eric's bones. "The choice is not yours. The triangle decides who stays and who is freed." The shadows holding him grew tighter, pulling him closer to the monolith. Its surface rippled, and the spectral forms around it began to dissolve into its glowing core. Eric's vision blurred, the weight of countless lives crushing him. Then, through the haze, he saw a familiar face, Mira, her eyes wide, her mouth forming silent words. "She's still alive," Eric whispered, his heart twisting. "Her fate is sealed," the voice boomed, "unless you sever the chain." "What chain?" Eric demanded. The figure pointed to the monolith. "Destroy it, and the triangle will collapse, but the cost will be eternal suffering. You will bear the pain of every soul lost here." Eric's hands trembled as he reached for the shard of metal strapped to his belt. his heart pounding with fear and determination. The figure loomed closer, its voice now a low, menacing growl. "Decide, Captain. Balance or oblivion." With a final cry, Eric drove the shard into the glowing monolith. The chamber erupted in light, and a deafening roar filled the air. The shadows recoiled, and the spectral form screamed as the monolith began to crack. The triangle itself seemed to quake, the weight of its ancient power unraveling, and then everything went black. Eric awoke to suffocating silence, his body aching as if it had been crushed under the weight of the ocean. He was sprawled on the stone floor of the chamber, the once pulsing monolith now shattered into jagged, lifeless fragments. The faint glow that had permeated the room was gone, replaced by an oppressive darkness. For a moment, he thought he was alone, but then the whispers returned, not as an ominous chant, but as faint, sorrowful murmurs. "Eric." He turned toward the voice and saw Mira standing in the shadows, her form flickering like a dying flame. Her eyes were filled with both fear and relief. "You broke the cycle," she said softly. "The triangle, it's collapsing." Eric staggered to his feet, his head spinning. He could feel the world around him shifting, the walls of the chamber beginning to crack and crumble. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice hoarse. "Where's the plane?" Mira shook her head. "The others, they're gone. The triangle claimed them." Eric's chest tightened. He had hoped that by destroying the monolith, he could save his passengers, but the truth weighed heavily on him. They were lost, just like the countless souls before them. A deafening rumble echoed through the chamber as the ground beneath them began to quake. The shattered monolith emitted one last flicker of light before dissolving into dust. "This place is falling apart," Mira said, grabbing his arm. "We don't have much time." They sprinted through the collapsing spire, the walls groaning as pieces of stone fell around them. The once majestic underwater city was now a chaotic ruin, its towers crumbling into the abyss. As they reached the platform where the Nautilus II had landed, a blinding light engulfed them. For a moment, Eric felt the same weightlessness as before, the sensation of being pulled through an invisible barrier. When the light faded, he was back in the cockpit of his plane, the controls steady in his hands. The passengers were gone, and the world outside was calm, the endless blue sky stretching over a tranquil sea. "Did I make it out?" he whispered, his voice trembling. But then the radio crackled. "This is Flight 19, a faint voice called. "Mayday, we're lost. Coordinates unknown." Eric's blood ran cold. He knew now that the triangle wasn't truly destroyed. It had merely reset, waiting for its next victim. And he was still part of it. The beacon flared on the horizon once more, and Eric realized with chilling clarity, the cycle was unbreakable. He would fly again, and again, forever.